members and guests of the College Historical Society, it is, as ever, an honour and a pleasure to be addressing this chamber for what I think is in or around my 16th chamber speech, which I think is reasonably impressive, given that I was only actually properly here for like 2 years that I was in college. Anyway, my main aim in this speech is not just to prove to you why we should indeed support the rise of China, but also the fact that in the last 6 months I've actually learned something about international relations for the first time in my life. So basically what I want to talk to you about today is what the world looks like on both sides of this motion. What the world looks like where we have rising China, and what the world looks like when we don't. Specifically what I mean when I say the rise of China, I'm talking about a country that is economically, diplomatically more powerful, more influential, a country that has that can be referred to as a regional power or is definitely heading in that direction. And the way I see both sides of this motion panning out are, on the one side, on the proposition side, if you have a another rising power, you have a more balanced world that is revolving around two main superpowers, mainly being the US and China. On the other hand, you continue to have a world that is largely dominated by the United States. So I want to talk to you about two main points today. First of all, about hegemony in general. Second of all, specifically about American hegemony. And overall, why the rise of China is a good thing in dealing with that, as I see it, problem. So the idea of hegemony. What do you have in a world where one country, one power, one regional power, essentially has more influence than any other power in the world? The way I see it is you have one vision dominating the whole world. Like, under the status quo, most of the rest of the world's countries, most of the rest of the world's actors are allied with the United States or are dependent with them in some way or another, or at the very least do not have the potential to compete with them in the way that China does, right? And the problem with hegemony like that is you have that one singular ideology of that country dominating the world, because no country that goes against that ideology can actually compete. It cannot develop the resource it needs to be a successful country, because no country is going to invest in it because of the power of that one dominating country. So what you have then is a world where there's no room for questioning or for challenging the structure advocated by that country. There's no, it becomes assumed that the ideologies, that the political systems, that the values put forward by that one power are right, because there is no room to question them. Because if you question them, like, all of the investment that would have gone into your country, all of the resources that could have been built in developing countries that would have opposed that views are gone because of the overwhelming dominance of that one power. Second of all, there's also no room for coexistence between differing ideologies, because again, if you only have one power, if you have one superpower, then there's a lack of investment in any country that goes against those views. And the problem there is that it also assumes that that particular version of the world is going to work for every single country, regardless of resources, regardless of other political systems, or anything like that. So essentially, China forming a second pole of the global political system allows for another major ally, allows for another major trading partner, allows for another major investment partner. That means that countries that are developing at the moment can choose a route that is different to that of so many states in the West, because they are not solely relying on the United States, on the EU, on all states that are allied with them for investment, for resources, for things like that. Essentially, China is another ally that countries can rely on to propose another way forward for their countries. So how does this play out in the parallel between American hegemony versus a world where you have two major powers? First of all, it means that there's less of a disadvantage for non-US allies. So for countries who are leaning towards socialism or towards communism, they are no longer completely abandoned by US and by their allies as they have done so far. We saw this throughout the Cold War. The US like trying to topple governments that it didn't agree with politically. Yeah, like stop, like no longer investing in countries that it saw going against its political interests, that it saw as undermining its influence. And like, even if you disagree with communism, like the problem is that it's difficult to see the justification of essentially starving a country out of it by like divesting all aid or investment from them. Like primarily because if you think that communism isn't going to work, that'll happen anyway. So you don't, like there's no justification for completely undermining a country taking another political view to yours. So again, like the presence of China on the world scene, their ability to invest in other countries, to invest in other ways forward, means that there are more options for developing countries that American hegemony will not let us see through to its logical conclusion. Go ahead.
So tied with American support and help is generally improvements in regards to human rights system. China doesn't ask for those same things. How do you respond to that?
Okay, thank you, because I almost forgot to bring this up. Like, America is not consistent in its forwarding of human rights policies, like through investment and through aid and things like that. It supports regimes, like places like the Philippines, like that, that do not have decent human rights records. And so whereas China, with its aid and investment and things like that, it has a lot less conditionality tied to it. And while on the one hand, like that means that they can advance human rights in the way that America claims to, it also means that there's not this like huge disadvantage between countries that the US like is allied with or isn't allied with. So like I think on both sides of the house, you're still going to have those gaps in terms of human rights. I don't think that the US does a very good or consistent job on that either. But the difference is with China, you don't have a massive, you don't have a huge disadvantage for countries that are leaning more towards socialism. The second thing then is that it reduces, China's presence reduces US dominance of the security system, which is super important because motivation for intervention, military intervention, is influence. And if there's no opposing power, I think it becomes a lot easier for the United States to go in with a half-baked plan of military intervention with no follow-through and to just leave a country completely in ruins because there's no one there to oppose them. We need a multipolar world. That is why we support the rise of China. Thank you very much.
Call upon Nicole O'Sullivan to make the case for the opposition.
Since this is your first speech in the chamber, you're entitled to our Old Maiden Prize. I suspect Larry will not be offering point of information for the entirety of your speech. If you choose to waive those rights, however, you will be greeted to your tongue or swearing applause.
I'd like to take the applause, please. In 2014, China was confirmed by the IMF as being the world's largest economy. Its growth as a world power has allowed it to become this century's economic centre of gravity, with all eyes focused on it. It is a superpower. We've heard a lot from Sinead in her previous speech that it's good that China is rising because it tackles hegemony and reduces US dominance. But I don't buy this, okay? As I'm going on to explain, the rise of China is a harmful one globally, and we shouldn't just have to, take it because, oh, we need somebody to tackle US dominance in general. We shouldn't just have to accept that. So that's just what I have to say there. But the main reason that I stand before you today on opposition side is because the specific ways that China is looking to gain power are incredibly harmful and detrimental to the world, as a whole, and smaller countries in particular. Maybe we'd be able to support the country's rise if it were peaceful, but it simply isn't. And as I'll go into outline, it's tactics simply evoke provocation. So I have two main points today. Firstly, the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and how harmful they are. And secondly, the economic disadvantages to smaller territories around the world, not just within the South China Sea area. Okay, so firstly, the South China Sea, as I said. This area and the question of who owns what lands have always been of contention. But what China is doing is basically claiming islands and territories in the sea, which it thinks is its own, even though it just has no right. And it's prepared to use any means to get those islands. It wants to take over any islands which lie within its kind of drawn up 9-dash line, as it's called, which, no coincidence, it encompasses 90% of the sea's fisheries, shipping lanes and energy resources. And the way that China is trying to gain control of these islands, and the reasons that it's giving for doing so, is where I have the problem. So China has increased its military and naval presence in the region, and to emphasize this power, it started building its own islands to act as naval, air force and missile bases. There are around 3,200 acres of built-up land in place already now. And even though the Chinese government heavily denies this, the incriminating evidence of like actual visible Chinese trawlers and machinery along the wonderfully named Mischief Reef, I don't know, says otherwise. So the force with which China is like launching and asserting a claim over these islands is shocking and provocative, and it's ready and poised to fight, and it's not afraid to give out that message. And it's not just in the sea where China is pushing its land claims. If we look at China's border with India in particular, we see a border dispute that's quickly weaponizing. India is already developing nuclear weapons in order to strike against China's weapons which already are in place. This already led to a full-on border standoff just last July. And then if we go over to the east, we see China's consistent poking at Japan over a string of islands known as the Senkaku Islands. In fact, Japan is even looking to amend their constitution in order to denounce the post-war pacifism to allow it to fight against China if needs be. So basically, tensions are rising. The way that China is creating its rise is a geographical one initially, by claiming land and pushing boundaries. It's not peaceful, and it's leading to an increased weaponization and military presence in the area. Even the US is getting involved, backing the smaller territories and sending boats and weapons to defend the waters. All that needs to happen is for one of the nations involved to strike or step out of line before it becomes a global problem. We don't need more like weapons or nukes or anything in the area, particularly at a time when tensions between like North Korea and the US are already so high. No thanks, maybe in a minute. You might ask, oh, but can't the law intervene? Literally, no. Like, even if a potential code of conduct was reached between China and the other nations, China still has an overbearing power economically and geographically to dictate the parameters of such a contract. It's kind of known that politically, China prefers to deal with other countries like in bilateral contracts, so one-on-one with another country, rather than it against a bunch of countries. So if that were the case, if it were to make a code of conduct, it would be just it and one other country, which means that it's very easily able to take, or not to take over, but like kind of persuade the smaller country to go its way or something like that. It'll never be faced with a huge panel of countries going against it. Or, you know, it might just simply choose to ignore any laws that are forced upon it. Like in 2013, when the Philippines sued China under breach of United Nations rights involving territory claiming, the UN Arbitration Court did reject Beijing's claims, so basically Beijing were in the wrong, but then China just kind of like refused the UN laws that were placed upon it. So it just kind of ignored it again and kept on building islands and kept on claiming lands. So all of that is basically, it's illegal, and it goes against any UN laws that are already in place. So law isn't an option. You might also ask, but hey, they might have some historical claim over the islands. And that's also now, the historical claims that they have are less persuasive. Like China believes that it owns these lands, owns the islands because it maintains the ethos and history of being a colonial power, which has been strengthened tenfold by the increased like assertive nationalism and like exceptionalism that it fostered during the whole economic boom, which, due to its economic regime, which led to the economic boom like in the first place. And it knows that its attempts to annex parts of the sea have no moral or historical or legal justification, and it's even gone so far as to produce dubious fake historical documents to back up its claim, and they're just not true. So essentially that just doesn't hold. And if you wanted to like say that history was a reason why you have claim over these lands, then you could say that Mongolia should be able to have the entire like of Asia because it once owned it as well. So basically, China's island claiming is dangerous and illegal and unfounded, but it views it as a key tenet in its rise as a nation, and this is what its rise as a nation means to China. We can't support this sort of unpeaceful rise. I'll take Stephen.
Your case is that land disputes are bad. Do you think a poverty-ridden, economically hamstrung China that isn't dependent on international trade and globalization is better, or is a more stable or less stable comparative?
I feel like China, like if it wanted to rise, it could do so in a way like in a lot less harmful way than it is right now. Like the way that it's rising now puts people under harm. And as I'm going to talk about economics, I'll say it really briefly that like it will also harm it in that way. So I think that there are much better ways that China could rise without being necessarily poverty stricken. I don't think there's only two options here. So I'm just going to briefly mention quickly my economic point. So basically, if you're a small country in the South Asian Sea, there's a very delicate kind of balancing game at play, like the trade-off between security and economics. Like China is now, as I said, economic centre of gravity and financially brings a net positive impact for Asia. But even its most alienated countries can't ignore its economic pull. So basically, the rhetoric that China touts is one of, if you don't deal nicely with us, if you don't let us invest in your country, or if you don't let us buy out your country, then we're going to isolate you maybe from trade lines or shipping routes, because China essentially controls all of those, all of the key shipping routes in the area. So basically, like, China can get away with its unpeaceful rise because it's scaring its adversaries into submission using threats of blockades and trade isolation. So basically, it's using its trade as a weapon and as a tool to rise itself, which causes damage in the process. So to conclude, I know that the second point was super brief, but so to conclude, what have I brought to you today? 2 main points. Firstly, that China's growth technique of claiming islands and pursuing it to territorial rise is so harmful to not only Asia, but the world as a whole. And secondly, that China's power play and force imbalance is economically detrimental to the region. Thank you, and I beg you to please.
Thank you. I'm now very pleased to call upon Dan O'Brien to make the case for the proposition.
Good, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Maiden speakers' rights, I'm not sure I can claim them. Is this the only society that debates in this chamber? Okay, because I've spoken here before, but I can't quite remember if it was with you folks or not. Anyway, I think I'll waive the speakers' rights and welcome any questions. Death and taxes. There are only 2 things, they say, that are inevitable in life. Let me make the case that there is a third thing, and that's the rise of China. And if you can't stop something, you may as well embrace it. So let me take a slight liberty and say, rather than supporting the rise of China, let me say I think we need to embrace it. And I make the case on 3 different foundations. 1, demographics, 2, economics, and 3rd is China's sense of itself historically. So the demographics and the economics are closely linked. Let's go all the way back. When our ancestors walked out of Africa 100,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, nobody knows, but the planet was empty. And over the millennia, people walked to the furthest corners of the planet. And by the time the last ice age ended about 12,000 years ago, the entire planet had been populated. People were everywhere. And over the following millennia, the 2 places in the world that became the most densely populated, that had the biggest populations, were the Asian Himalayan river systems, and in particular what we now call Asia, China and India. These were the 2 hugely most populated parts of the world. Now, if we go back over time economically, and the only reference I'd make this evening to an academic is Angus Deaton, the economic historian, who's attempted to measure how big economies are over time. Now, let's admit it. We economists can't even measure economies right now, so it's not very accurate. So the notion that somebody can go back and measure the size of the Chinese economy, the Indian economy, and the European economy 2,000 years ago is fanciful. But you can make a reasonable effort at it, and I don't think there's any huge disagreement that because the places 2,000 years ago and before and since that have been the most populous in the world, they've also been where most economic activity has taken place. In other words, the difference in prosperity per person around the world historically has been quite small. So the difference between somebody who lived in a Stone Age society 6,000, 5,000 years ago and somebody who lived in Egypt of the Pharaohs was much smaller than the difference that came about, particularly with the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution transformed things. The differences in per capita income, wealth creation became hugely divergent over the past 200 years. And the West had this very unusual period of going far ahead of everywhere else in the world. That is now closing again. And we're coming back to a much more normal state of affairs where the gaps in income, GDP, or whatever way you want to describe it, is narrowing again. In other words, the implication of that is that the places with the biggest populations will tend to have the biggest economies. And as has already been mentioned, China has recently come, by some measures, to be the biggest economy in sheer size in the world, overtaking the United States. So China also had the mistake, if I may say so, of going down that cul-de-sac of state socialism in the 20th century, which caused it to fall even further behind. But over the past 40 years, that has changed and transformed, and it's now in the position that it is as the largest country, the largest economy in the world. So that's the demographics and the economics, but demographics isn't destiny. One thing one might say is, okay, so if it's all about the sheer size of your country in people terms, what's the other standout country in the world? India. The third most populous country in the world is the United States, around 300 million people, which is only a quarter of India and China. So one would think, if it's all about the sheer number of people that you have, that India is the obvious natural competitor to China. And in many ways it is. They are strategic rivals increasingly in Asia. But I think there's a big difference. And anyone who spent any time in Beijing, Shanghai on the one hand, and Delhi and Mumbai on the other, will notice lots of differences. But one of the big things is the sense Chinese have about their destiny, about their role in the world, versus how Indians feel. And I would put it that Indians do not feel that they have a destiny as a world's leading power. There's certainly Indian nationalism, there is a desire to be more influential in the world, but there is not that history of a coherent state actor in India that there so obviously is in China. Please.
Could you not have said the same thing about the United States before it abandoned isolationism post the Second World War?
Say the same thing
about the United States in the early 1900s, because you're saying that India's hopes for eventual world power, you know.
Yeah, well, I think there's a big difference between the United States and India. The United States is a very young country. It still is a very young country. So in the 19th century, it was an exceptionally young country. So it, almost by definition, turned a sense of itself. Whereas India is an ancient country, not in the sense of having a coherent large state, but it is a much more ancient country, and its sense of culture and history is much deeper than that of the United States, I'd put it to you. So for those three reasons, it seems to me that China has no long-term natural rival, certainly within the region, and because of its sheer size and its capacity and its 40 years of incredible growth in its demonstration of its capacity for innovation, it's now by far and away the most innovative country, if you want to measure that by the number of patents issued in a single year. It now patents more new inventions than any other country in the world, an extraordinary achievement for a country that came from the position China did just 4 decades ago. So it's also a sense of great economic growth and innovation for the rest of the world, a benefit to everyone else. There are many challenges from the rise of China, particularly in terms of individual liberty, the rule of law, and the rules-based multilateral system that we in the West have invented, and bringing China into that will be an enormous challenge, there's no doubt. But when something can't be embraced, I would argue that it must be, when something can't be stopped or prevented, it must be embraced. Thank you.
To advance the case for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you very much. The motion put forward tonight is not one about Chinese people, nor it is about the sincerity of their want to further the march of progress of mankind, or the honesty of their belief that their nation's political ideology, institution and policies are the best way to achieve this. All of this is beyond reproach. No, this motion concerns something dishonest, malevolent and dangerous, and that is the China that has emerged notwithstanding these bona fide intentions. How it acts at home and abroad, and how it thinks according to the values it has extrapolated from the mandate of its people. Seldom in history has it been possible to witness seismic shifts in geopolitics in such slow motion as that of China's rise. Only through the spontaneous mania of the Second World War could the United States entrench its position as leader of the West. We have been able to see, slow and surely, what was once a disparate pariah state emerge as a superpower of great economic strength, internal unity, and of foreign presence. Its footsteps are now heard worldwide. Its thoughts are subject to manic speculation by both world markets and policy makers, and its club can swing far. China's rise will affect everyone. It is for these reasons that I reject this motion tonight and believe that the rise of China should not be supported. Since its formation, the People's Republic of China has consistently maintained that it does not wish to establish predominance or yield substantial influence over both regional and world affairs, but the reality is simply not the case. All over the world, Chinese companies are investing and taking shares in industries prominent to the economy and vital to national security: infrastructure, power, military technology. Greece this year blocked an EU statement at the UN condemning China's disregard for internal human rights after China's Costco bought a 51% controlling share in Greece's largest port. In the USA, the State Department has been instructed to form a policy on curtailing the presence of China in the research and development markets on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, whilst the Chinese in turn hold $840 billion in securities to the US Treasury. In Africa, more than 750,000 Chinese personnel are directing his projects, often in extracting minerals and natural resources, which subsist of almost exclusively the commanding heights of these African economies. It is no coincidence that by selling arms to often unstable African states, China is obliquely, even if without intent, fueling the civil wars to keep these states vulnerable. They have repeatedly ignored court rulings on territorial boundaries in the South Asian Sea, are conducting daily war games in the region, and are artificially expanding small islands to facilitate military spaces. Thus, to say that China is not attempting to assert its dominance on the world stage is little short of foolish. But why should this not be supported? Being a superpower is not an evil in itself. Nations across the world are endowed with varying degrees of strength. Surely it's not abnormal that China, with the world's largest population, should rise so fast and so far. After all, the US has been notorious in abusing its position of world leader by attempting to influence the politics of other nations. Why is China any worse than the USA? The answer to this question is that China simply does not share any of the values that underpin democracy or protect the sanctity of life and all the rights and freedoms this entails. If you are gay, your orientation and relationships are classed in law as abnormal. Your portrayal in the media is censored and you can face economic discrimination. If you are a feminist, your protests are labelled as disorderly conduct. And even in the city of Wuhan, legislation is being debated on fining you if you have children outside of wedlock. If you are a prisoner, you are subjected to torture, degrading and inhumane treatment that the state unofficially sanctions. If you believe in God, you risk prosecution if you don't belong to the state-approved and controlled churches. You are the subject of vilifying propaganda. Your neighbours are encouraged to hate you and to inform you to the authorities with false charges. Torture, organ harvesting and psychiatric abuse are so rampant that courts in Spain and Argentina have indicted Chinese officials for genocide and crimes against humanity. If you are an ethnic minority, you can even be forced in some areas to register yourself to the local authority before you can buy a car. There is no right to speech beyond that which the state approves, nor is there any more for press, association or assembly. Your life, your choices, your well-being and your happiness are subordinate to the needs of the many via the decision of men that you have no power to challenge. There is no such thing as human rights. This is simply not in tandem with the idea that you are to be utilised as you must for the needs of the state. If you believe in democracy, as they do in Hong Kong, your choice of how government must be approved by China itself. Your protests will incur riot control, your reasons will be censored and distorted, and the full extent of your current rights and freedom will only be guaranteed by law until 2047. No. If you in any way hold dear the freedoms you currently enjoy, the rights you are ordained with by virtue of being a human being, or recognise the importance of being able to check and balance those who rule you, then this is abhorrent. But this is more than abhorrent, this is a looming threat. By aggressively expanding the range of their influence abroad through inter alia, the ways I have described, China is undermining sovereign democracies, the legitimacy of human rights and the rule of law. Be it from Asia to Africa to Oceania, China is weakening these concepts, and if that is not a threat, then I don't know what is. The weakening of democracy and human rights anywhere is a threat to these things everywhere. And that is why I believe that the rise of China should not be supported. If you tonight are not sold on points of economics, or that China wants to disturb world peace, then that's fine. Like all those can be disputed with good points on either side. But all of these points set aside, the clear and incontrovertible threat of China to these values and ideals is reason enough to think twice on where you stand, and I beg you to vote down this motion tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Betsy Drew to advance the case for the proposition.
Bessie, since this is also your first time speaking in the chamber, you're also entitled to these rights.
I'll waive my right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here. I would like to address some of the points that is raised by the opposition before I reach to my point. The first opposition brought up how China's rise in the world is actually a threatening rise. I'm not sure if the opposition really knows about China to be saying about that. Because China in its rise, like in 2013, President Xi brought up the Belt and Road Initiative, which focuses on connectivity and cooperation between Eurasian countries, promotes globalization, supports multilateral trading system, and boosts economic and financial cooperation in an all-around manner. Also, if China's rise is a threatening rise or detrimental to the world, then why are China not planting military troops like the US in countries where we support? Also, China also brought up the initiative of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where we are giving money to people for developing their infrastructure in the Asia-Pacific region.
Information?
Yeah.
Do you think that these plans being put forward by China, India has interpreted them as a provocation, particularly in areas like Pakistan? Do you not think that China is actually creating more trouble in the region by reaching out to these nations?
I do not think so, because China would like to help. China knows that only China developing is not sustainable. The world needs to grow together in order to have a sustainable world. And for the South China Sea dispute, I would like to address the lands. I would like to ask you guys a question. If England come over and say that a county in Ireland is actually belong to them, what would you think? This is literally what's the South China Sea dispute. So, and the China-Japan relationship, so many people have talked to me about how they don't understand why the Chinese dislike the Japan or are in tension with Japan, and I would like to make this point here today. First, if someone takes your property and claim it's theirs, would you be happy? And two, after invading China in the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan not only didn't apologize and didn't even admit it was an invasion, they even changed textbook contents in their educational system and manipulated the history that they're teaching to their newborn generations. They're manipulating materials on the Nanking Massacre, which is an episode of mass murder, and they're manipulating the Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that undertook lethal human experimentation during the Second Sino-Japanese War based in China, where the US gave immunity to the researchers from the trial of war crimes in exchange for the data they gathered through human experimentation. Japan is a democratic and capitalist country in the Western view, but this country, where regarded as having the freedom of information, and where the media is not controlled by the government, is actually manipulating and changing the true history that they're teaching to their newborn generations. Is this what the freedom of information that the Western criticized China to lack about? Also, for no democracy, there is an election system in China. Local people's congresses are directly elected by the people, and all the higher levels are elected by the local people.
Information. Why are those in Hong Kong and allowed to elect their own leaders?
They're allowed to elect.
They aren't. They have to be approved for the People's Republic of China.
The local representatives are elected by the people, and then the higher levels of people's congresses are elected by the local representatives on assessing the quality of work or the amount of benefits they created for the people. And Chinese people do get a very early experience of democracy and voting, as we vote our class leader in primary school. So, and the point on how Chinese is selling arms to Africa states, America is granting tied aids to Africa, where Africa needs to spend all their money back to US, even more than what they get from the US, to buy arms, to buy weapons from them.
On that point, a lot of the aid which China gives to Africa as well is even more tied than the aid the US and other European countries give to Africa. How do you respond?
I actually do not agree on that, because most of China's aid is actually provided freely and they're using the tax money from the Chinese people to help, like we sent doctors over to help them in when they're like suffering from diseases or anything. So, and about freedom of information and controlled media, I do not really agree that the Western world have actually what they criticize Chinese as lacking, because in 2012, Edward Snowden, who revealed Americans' phone records is provided to the NSA, spying on world leaders and foreign government. The PRISM program that allow NSA to directly access the servers of US tech giants like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. So people's information are actually tracked by the US government. Also, the Western world also use a double standard in terms of China, because like this Catalonia and Spain disputes that's recently happened, the Europe or US are saying, oh, we're not going to make a comment about this. This is Spain's own political business issue. But in terms of China and Hong Kong, the US and the Europe is actually making comments, oh, why don't you give the rights to the people in Hong Kong? They're trying to separate Hong Kong from China to cause disputes. Also in the South China Sea, US is actually sending troops over and spying on China's military actions every single day, nearly. And so thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to call Anna Kilkilati to speak for the opposition.
Thank you. Great job on the last name, actually. That was well pronounced. I'm kind of worried I might be sort of like leading this debate a bit astray here, but I'm just going to like shamelessly like now frame this in this sort of like capitalist paradigm. I'm not sorry for it. Like I think that's the only reasonable opposition that I really want to like get up here and debate tonight. First of all, just kind of on like what we've seen before. So first we had this like super state-centered IR-frame being set up by Sinead, and yeah, we can talk about that, but like I just don't know how relevant that is when we have this like open world economy that is like super dynamic and everything. I think there's like bigger problems that we could talk about. And yeah, like maybe then there is this one ideology that is being imposed by the US that is capitalism, but like, you know, like capitalism is not going to be going anywhere. Like it's completely changed the way the world works, and like I think it's kind of reasonable to set our debate within that paradigm. So yeah, like what I'm going to do, I'm just going to deliver this collection of kind of anxieties that like actors in financial markets across the world would have about China, and I think like that's kind of a good way to go with this motion. And like just like kind of on everything that's taken place so far, like I totally recognise that China has done progress on quite a few things recently, like even like to a certain extent on human rights, and like literally like, no state is perfect. Like every state does like spin, every state like attempts to a certain extent to like control their population. Every state wants to be seen in a good light, like by the that's why we're having this debate. But of course, there's like probably some things with China that like from our perspective seem a bit more dire than what the US is doing, for instance. And you know that's like we can like keep on like airing this like dirty laundry about that for like until the cows come home. That's fine. But I just don't think like that's the most important debate now, because there's like a real economy that is like constantly happening, and there's like real dangers there that I want to like tell you about. So yeah, basically my problem with China is like we have this leadership that is just trying to kind of run a planned economy that is like directly embedded in this like aggressively dynamic new global economy that we don't even really understand yet. So then there's just this like with that there's no way we can support this like openness, this obsession with like setting these political targets about that economy. Like there's just no way to manage it in that way. And like, yeah, I said I totally accept China is trying to do new things with that, but I think ultimately that probably will not work unless they like radically accept that that's a problem. then, you know, like, I totally accept the rise of a developing country can never be done in this sort of wholesome way where like everybody's happy and there's no like social or economic or environmental trade-offs. But like, I think there's many aspects of how China has risen there that like I can agree with and I think like could have been done better. And yeah, like, just basically, if you have like this country that has become like hugely important to the global economy and it's not open, that's a huge risk for us all. Like, and kind of to show why that is a problem, I have some kind of technocratic points about the currency, the credit markets, and overall openness and information about the economy. And like, if we kind of just openly like embrace China without criticizing the way it's managed, we're complicit in this sort of dysfunctional system that very likely could like start the next global recession, and that for me is a problem that's going to like harm real people all over the world, and that's why we need to talk about it. So let's first talk about the currency. Like, just a really quick economics lesson. So when you think about your currency, you have like this holy trinity of three things you can do. You can have like a fixed exchange rate, adjusting interest rates as a policy tool, free movement of capital. Like, you have to leave one of those out. You can't have all of those. And what China has done is restrict the movement of capital. And that's not necessarily a great idea when you have this world where like capital is like electronically being shifted around the world all the time. What it results in is just like an economy that just has a bit of slack, isn't inefficient. We just don't get this like signaling at all for capital to go where it should within China, and we're already seeing that as a problem. We're already seeing Chinese growth slowing down, and like obviously on top of it, it also just limits like practical investment in China, like practical Chinese people managing their wealth, and yeah, like directly relating to this currency issue, of course, like, you know, you've heard Trump talk about this a lot. Like, the People's Bank of China still like actively does seek to manipulate the like supply of renminbi and like through that keep the exchange rate depreciated. And you know, like that's like Trump's one of his main talking points. And like, you know, obviously it's not like a black and white issue where China is just like doing something that is like purely unfair to other countries, but like, I think there is like a certain extent which countries are justified to be bitter about that. For instance, like what was brought up, like the treasury holdings, like obviously that's just like one part of like that's one of the things they're buying to sustain the currency. And well, yeah, I guess like Eurozone periphery countries aren't exactly complaining about that, but that's fine. And like there's just so many benefits to like taking on a like more flexible monetary an arrangement. So like, first of all, you have that issue of fairness. Then you have like, if you have a flexible currency, you get consumption smoothing. So that means like real people in China don't have to like face unnecessary unemployment. Real people in other countries don't have to face unnecessary unemployment because the currency will depreciate and appreciate in tandem with how demand and supply change as a result of shocks. And yeah, for that reason, it would be like, that would be one really big thing I would criticize. On top of this, like, just ultimately this lack of dynamicism in the Chinese economy, it's resulted in a debt crisis. And honestly, like, this is such a big thing. This is something that, like, a lot of people are very worried about. So if we talk about, like, Chinese, like, how much China is levered at the moment, so how much, like, debt China is holding, we're at, like, 166% of the GDP. That's as much for corporate credit. That's just much as, like, for the US at the peak of, like, 2008, just before the crisis started. Like, that's a huge problem that's probably going to, like, eventually, when the markets give up on, like, trying to sustain it, that's probably going to, like, cause a huge market correction. And it already has twice. So we've already had these like two huge sell-offs off the back of this concern about the credit market in August 2015 and in January 2016. So like this is something that like very possibly could be like the cause of the next financial crisis. And on top of that, like just overall, like Chinese, like the state is not releasing like enough data for the markets to be comfortable with it. Like there's like this very kind of like set consensus that the Chinese economic data is just not reliable, and like people are just literally like coming up with like they're looking at like flights and satellites, and you know, if you have like people managing like billions of dollars and they have to like make decisions about this is just not sustainable. And you know, like that's your life savings, like maybe that's people's jobs, that's people's real lives, and for those reasons I beg you to oppose this motion.
Thank you. I'll now invite Stephen Brennan-Spa to conclude the case for the proposition.
I think large parts of the opposition case were correct, but misidentify what this debate is about. I think when Kuhnel outlines the human rights abuses in China, he is correct to do so, but what we actually need in this debate is a meaningful comparative in which a country like China never successfully developed and rose to the stature it is. I think it was outlined quite well by our guest speaker that China, unless it was severely impoverished or held at an economic low, is necessarily has to be an economic power given its history and the sheer size of its population. If you want to look at how economies were historically measured, it was by their size, because generally things tend to stay quite the same, so size just pretty much means you have a bigger economy. So necessarily this debate is linked to the economics of China and its economic development since the late 1970s. First of all, I want to deal with two things. I think Anna's speech is correct in diagnosing problems with the Chinese economy and the Chinese economy going forward. First of those is that the problem of Chinese capitalism as it stands at the moment is there's not enough capitalism and they need more capitalism. Secondly, I think most of these things are stuff that will generally be phased out as that economy grows. They have been doing capitalism for a significantly shorter time than places like the United States, places like places like the United Kingdom and the rest of Western Europe. It's quite a new concept and being tried out there from what used to be a Maoist party, which still tries to do some of those ideas within their policy. I think it's going to take a while for that sort of influence to dilute out, but I think it's something that will happen over time and will be beneficial when it does. So what was this debate necessarily about? Recognise we have to establish, was this good for China in its general? Because when you have an economy of around 1.4 billion people, it's probably like 1/7 at least the world population, or like over 1/7 the world's population is affected by what happens in that economy. So if you could make things better in that economy for those people, you help the world on a large scale just by numbers, right? So it's important to know what goes on in China as well, how that benefits those people. So was it good for people in China? Secondly, was it good for the world in general? Because I think it's a very pessimistic picture to paint of China as just this country that's trying to grab a bunch of small islands off their coast. I think there's a more significant role they're playing in the global economy, which has been a lot more important, a lot more beneficial, and largely ignored. No. First of all, was this necessarily good for China? Like, the liberalization of the Chinese economy in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping was generally considered one of the greatest economic moves ever due to the significant amount of people lifted out of poverty. On a real number, it was about 800 million people were lifted out of absolute poverty. That is a significant number of people, cannot be ignored. Like, if you want to talk about growth in human rights, I think millions of people, like hundreds of millions of people being access to food, water and education is a massive shift in human rights that has been resulting from the rise of China. That is something that is so massive and more sway. It's much more important than some prisoners having their human rights abused in prison. I know it's not a nice thing to say, but it's something you have to make that way up, and that way up is going to happen anyway. Because they never told you why China would not do these things if it was a poor country. Poor countries do awful stuff all the time. That's not what this debate's about. It's what has necessarily been the benefit of China getting rich. They have chosen to focus on stuff that is not instrumentally affected at all by the Chinese economy, or if it is affected at all, tends to lean on our side. So when they want to talk about China's human rights abuses of its own citizens, I ponder in a world, what is China more likely to be receptive of international standards? Is it going to be in a world where they're isolationist and alone, say like a country like North Korea, or even countries like Saudi Arabia, for example? They're just quite insular and don't actually interact with the wider economy. You're much harder to put actual influence in those economies when they're not linked with you for stuff like trade, not linked to you in stuff like media and all our networks and stuff like governments. That means that you're more likely to get change on the side of the house where China is rising and being exposed to more of the world and being exposed to more changeable norms. A growing middle class is vital for developing a democratic country in the first place, because you need that sort of political push for it. That push only comes when you can grow a middle class. That only comes when that economy of that country can grow, which is what we have seen in China. And we see China consistently pushing to more liberal values every day now. It's a slow process, but it is a process that is happening gradually instead of in a massive revolution of bloodshed. That is an impetus for change on banks existing and all other sorts of economic problems. Recognise no economy is perfect. China isn't perfect, but it suffers some faults that all economies suffer from, and what necessarily it is important. Secondly, the stuff about the rest of the world being better off in China. this is very tropey of me, but the TPP was lauded to be one of the greatest ever trade deals ever put forward, ever. What that meant was millions of people in Southeast Asia and the Pacific region would have been lifted out of poverty in places like Vietnam and other member states of that country. That was torpedoed when US isolationism set in under the Trump administration in early 2017, or 2017, when that deal was torpedoed on day one. China stepped up to the forefront in pushing globalization and intermediate trade-booming countries with stuff like the RCEP, the Asian Regional Comprehensive Partnership, because they know the merits of globalization and the benefit it gives to their own citizens. Like, I'm not saying every country is pretty much selfish, there's something we have to, but the self-interest of China has been massively beneficial when these trade deals are able to produce and lift people in the affected countries out of poverty. Because China and India still don't have a trade deal. Korea and Japan don't have trade deals, and Korea and India don't have trade deals. Massive economies dislinked. China wants to try and bring all these countries together in order to promote trade within them. It will benefit China? Yes. Will it benefit those other countries? Yes, and lift massive amounts of people out of poverty. That is a cause that is not being championed by any other global superpower in this current status quo, because globalization is going massively downhill under the current US. In terms of people like to say, oh, China's one of the biggest polluters. China have invested $89 billion in renewable energy. They are set to be, by 2040, 1/4 of the renewable energy output in the world economy. They have given nearly $1 trillion in overseas aid, somewhat dubious as well, and have exceeded the US in science spending. In terms of net good to the world, they're doing quite a significant amount. Yes, is it selfishly motivated? Correct. But is it something that is necessarily beneficial to everyone else as a result? Yes. Propose.